Welcome to this review of Antigua and Barbuda's economic performance for the period January to June 2012. We remain cautiously optimistic about the recovery path of the global economy. Stresses in the financial markets and the sovereign debt markets have yet to be contained, particularly in Europe. In the United States, second quarter growth amounted to 1.5%, which is a decrease in performance compared to growth of 2% in the first quarter. This decline in the rate of growth is the result of easing consumer spending in our main tourism market. Emerging economies, particularly China, Brazil, and India, are growing, though at lower than anticipated rates. All of this notwithstanding, a number of key economies are implementing new policies and wide-ranging structural reforms to boost recovery efforts. In this regard, Antigua and Barbuda is no different. The government of Antigua and Barbuda remains committed to our goal of long-term economic sustainability. I will use the opportunity of this second review to apprise you of the fiscal performance of the economy up to June, to update you on the progress of selected ongoing initiatives to strengthen some of our key institutional structures, and to report on the just concluded IMF review and Article 4 consultations. Overall, fiscal performance for the period January to June 2012 improved by 42% compared to the same period in 2011. An analysis of revenue performance shows total revenue amounted to $329.8 million, a 3.1% increase over the same period last year. The same contributors, or the main contributors, to this increase were the Antigua and Barbuda sales tax, the ABST, stamp duties, and the personal income tax. Revenue from the ABST amounted to $111.6 million, an increase of $8.5 million over the same period last year. This improvement in revenue from the ABST is attributed to modest improvement in economic activity, increased compliance, and other revenue reform initiatives. For the first half of 2012, revenue from stamp duties more than tripled, from $8.6 million to $27.8 million. This 224% surge is indicative of some recovery in economic activity. The personal income tax, PIT, also performed better in the first half of 2012 compared with the same period last year. We realized an increase in revenue of $2 million from $18.5 million at the end of June 2011 to $20.5 million at the end of June 2012. This improvement is due to a 34% increase in the second quarter of 2012 over the same period in 2011. A change in the PIT base to include allowances and benefits is responsible for this improvement in revenue intake. On the expenditure side, primary expenditure declined by $1 million from $310 million for the first half of 2011 to $309 million for the first half of 2012. Primary expenditure includes expenditure on wages and salaries, goods and services, and capital projects, but it excludes interest payments on government debt. Salaries and wages increased by $5 million from $131 million in the first half of 2011 to $136 million in the first half of 2012. This increase was due to employment of new teachers and upgrades to salaries and allowances for staff in various government departments. Overtime payments plummeted by 62% from $6 million in the first half of 2011 to $2.3 million in the first half of 2012. At this point, I think it's important to recognize the outstanding efforts of many government departments who have heeded the call to reduce overtime payments by restructuring their departments in a manner that would bring savings to the government and people of Antigua and Barbuda. I take this opportunity to congratulate sincerely those departments. Expenditure on goods and services grew by nearly $5 million. Included in goods and services is the promised expenditure on road maintenance, which increased by 87% from $750,000 in the first half of 2011 to $1.4 million in the first half of 2012. Here, we recognize that the Public Works Department is seeking to use the scarce resources at our disposal to concentrate on those areas which are worst hit and which are in greatest need of road repair. Other changes in expenditure for the first half of 2012 compared to the same period last year include pensions and gratuities, which increased by $2 million from $36 million to $38 million. This increase reflects the impact of attrition within the public sector. Transfers also increased by $2.4 million to $113.1 million. This amount includes payments made by central government on behalf of statutory corporations, including APUA and the Antigua Port Authority. Capital expenditure in the first half of 2012 amounted to $6.6 million, which is about 66% less than the $19.4 million spent in the first half of 2011. However, excluding capital grants of $16 million for the Barbuda Fisheries Project in the first half of 2011, capital expenditure actually grew by 113% from $3.1 million for the period ending June 2011 to $6.6 million for the same period in 2012. Turning now to public debt. Total interest payments on government debt have remained relatively constant at $35 million for the period under review. However, while there has been a 50% increase in external interest payments from $6 million to $9 million, domestic interest payments decreased by 10% from $29 million to $26 million when compared to the same period last year. The government's external interest payments have increased due to servicing of Paris Club obligations, as well as additional disbursements from the IMF and the Caribbean Development Bank. There was a decline in interest obligations on domestic debt because the government reduced its reliance on overdraft facilities for cash flow management and negotiated further decreases of interest rates on its loans with commercial banks. The debt stock, which includes central government and government guaranteed debt, remains relatively constant at $2.7 billion at the end of June 2012, though there were some changes in the composition. Moreover, central government debt declined by $100 million from $2.3 billion for the period ending June 2011 to $2.2 billion for the period ending June 2012. Government guaranteed debt increased by $100 million from $400 million to $500 million. This is due mainly to disbursements for the airport expansion project and the Wadadli power plant. Domestic debt represents 56% or $1.5 billion of total debt. Of this, 763 million is debt to banks, 143 million in treasury bills and bonds, and 119 million in debt to contractors and suppliers. External debt is 44%, or 1.2 billion of total debt, and is comprised of 703 million in bilateral debt, 191 million in commercial debt, and 305 million in multilateral debt. Looking at our overall fiscal performance for the period January to June 2012, recurrent revenue increased by 26.6 million, while expenditure increased by 11.6 million. Since revenue grew at a faster pace than expenditure, the government was able to realize a primary surplus of 21 million, which is 10.7 million greater than the 9.5 million surplus recorded in the first half of 2011. This primary surplus means that the government was able to cover its non-debt obligations with the revenues generated in the first half of the year. Once interest payments of 35 million are taken into account, there is an overall deficit of 14.4 million for the first half of 2012. This represents a 42% improvement in the overall deficit when compared to the first half of 2011. The overall deficit was financed by a portion of the disbursements under the IMF standby arrangement and proceeds from the treasury bills issued on the Regional Government Securities Market, the RGSM. Remaining funds from these disbursements were used to amortize central government debt and reduce arrears to domestic suppliers and contractors.